You will notice that in the background, it's not my usual t-shirt. This is a t-shirt we very memorably picked up at a street protest in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. A very earnest, very small protest. I posted photographs of it on the internet of Vietnamese refugees asking, why can't Vietnam also become a democracy? With voting, the freedom of speech to criticize government, dissent, pluralism, really we mean pluralism of political opinion here, multiple party competition, all those things we take for granted in the Western world. Why not? Why not Vietnam also? In the year 2019 or 2020 or as soon as possible? Why not? And then, of course, in the Canadian context, why can't the government of Canada make some sincere efforts to encourage this kind of political change to happen? It is very, very easy for people to sink into pessimism about democracy, about the potential for countries like Vietnam and North Korea and China, countries around the world, to make the transition from dictatorship to democracy. And the purpose of this video, long story short, is to argue that that pessimism is misplaced. I'm going to pause now for a brief sort of channel update. I've hinted repeatedly that what I'm doing with my channels, plural, what I'm doing on YouTube is about to change very fundamentally and dramatically. That change, I would say, has been delayed by about 1 month because we're right now in the process of packing up and moving to Taiwan. We're moving from Canada to Taiwan, with Taiwan being our home, presumably, for the indefinite future, for as long as the future lasts. We will see. So this video, like the majority of my videos about politics, is gathering together and reflecting on the accumulated research of the past 20 years, really more than 20 years of my life. And that's not what I want to do on YouTube. I want to start really creating original content for the audience that's based on active research, ongoing research, my learning new things, my challenging myself, and where it's not really a process of me making videos that I would find interesting, but of me trying to serve a public service by really providing information that the world can't easily get, because I'm aware of just how poor political analysis is on YouTube, through podcasts, through radio, even through print media. I paid for a subscription to FP. FP abbreviates Foreign Policy Magazine. Woo, we're going through a really, really dark period for journalism, even on the most mainstream of questions in politics, let alone, really fundamental questions like the future of democracy in Vietnam and China. Those shouldn't be trivial concerns, but they're treated as incredibly marginal, obscure topics, as if they're not of interest to, 1 billion people. Both on the left and on the right, I encounter a great deal of pessimism about parliamentary democracy. So many of my videos, I talk about the contrast between democracy in a deeper sense, going back to Athens and Aristotle and so on and so forth. This video, we're instead dealing with the contrast between outright dictatorship, whether that's communist dictatorship or fascist dictatorship, or just ersatz military dictatorship. The contrast between dictatorship and shallow, modern parliamentary democracy. Not the higher ideals of democracy we've inherited from the ancient Athenian tradition or those other more philosophical questions. The left wing and the right wing are both incredibly cynical about the potential for parliamentary democracy in the 21st century. But it's interesting to note that they're cynical for completely different reasons. When I talk to right-wingers all over the world, including, for example, I met a right-winger who was part of the dictatorship in Haiti. So that was the Papa Doc Duvalier dictatorship, followed by his son. His son was nicknamed Baby Doc Duvalier, the son of the older Duvalier. But anyway, Haiti had a series of dictatorships. And, I remember when I was first meeting and in fact, interviewing that guy, I thought, wow, I never thought I'd come face to face with a supporter of that regime. It's an incredibly notorious dictatorial regime. And he was a true believer. He was an earnest right-wing supporter. And he was typical of both the right wing and, hardline conservatives, in that the most fundamental reason for why he supported the dictatorship. And again, keep this in mind. Left-wingers, totally different reasons for making the same excuses, different motivations, different objectives. His fundamental reason was that he did not believe the people were capable of anything better. That if you allowed them democracy, they would collapse into something worse than the dictatorship. Now, communism is one example of something worse. Anarchy, just violence, lawlessness in the streets, whatever, various things are imagined, that poverty would get out of control. Of course, they imagine it's worse if the country gets poorer. They also imagine it's worse if the poor rise up and kill the rich, etc., etc. There are all these fears. But the pessimism about democracy and the excuse for supporting dictatorship was based on the assumption, which is ultimately racist and deeply elitist, that only some people in the world somehow are equipped for democracy. Like that there's something special about the Swiss, that there's something special about the Danish or the Scottish. This is kind of oddly parallel to Bernie Sanders now asking the question. Bernie Sanders goes around and confronts other American politicians and says, what do you think the Scottish have that we don't have? Why is it the Scottish can have healthcare, cheap university, not free, but cheap? In Germany, it's free. Other countries in Europe have free tuition or very, very low tuition. What is it that's special about Canada that Canada can provide healthcare for the poor and the United States cannot? What is the what is the inadequacy in the American people? What is it in us that you imagine? And of course, it's just challenging the absurdity of those assumptions. Now, people on the far left tend to reject the potential for a democracy, real-world, practical, parliamentary democracy, non-ideal democracy, for completely different reasons. They will, for example, sometimes construe that if the people had democracy, that would only result in the rich exploiting the poor, that would never represent the interests of the majority, ironically, because democracy is all about majority rule. And the hard left, the real communists, will basically try to create a scenario in which the only solution for the problems a country is in is revolution, is class war. Because the central philosophy of Marxism, which is passed on into socialism and communism, is the idea that the only way history makes progress is through class war, and that anything else is an unwanted distraction. So hilariously, it really is hilarious, you can read communist propaganda from Thailand in the 1970s and 1980s. Now again, Thailand is not paradise, but on a shallow level, so these people under the palm trees and on the rice farms of Thailand trying to sincerely publish and pass out communist literature saying like, oh, these problems with government, they can never be solved unless you have this terrible, violent, revolution and so on. And anyone looking at the pragmatic situation in Thailand, and Thailand is not that far away from Cambodia and Vietnam, countries that became communist, could say, no. These problems can be solved. Whatever it is. Corruption, police bribery. Thailand had problems. But you know what? I can think of better ways to solve them than getting rid of democracy. Maybe it's making democracy more robust or what have you. There is a great deal of utterly insincere, anti-democratic, pessimistic sentiment. And this is a new school of it now. I would call this the kind of, final stages of neoliberal ideology. This is a book, you can actually guess just from the title and subtitle. This is one of my professors, University of Victoria, wrote this, Wu Guoguang. Globalization Against Democracy, A Political Economy of Capitalism After Its Global Triumph. The basic thesis of this book is that neoliberalism has created a situation in which there is no advantage for China or any country to transition to democracy or maintain a democracy, that somehow the socioeconomic and free market conditions of the era we're now living in encourages the world to organize itself into a bunch of capitalist dictatorships along the lines of China and some other strongman nations, that there is no sort of force of gravity pulling them down to democracy in the late neoliberal era. And this is all very insincere and is strangely uninformed by real-world examples. So when I've talked to both left and right-wingers in person, face-to-face, and I've asked them about actual real-world transitions to democracy, it would not be an exaggeration to say they are flummoxed. Okay? Fascism sounds very scary. How did Spain make the transition from fascism to democracy? I think I first researched this at maybe 14 years old. It's such a distant memory. I'm really not clear on it. And as you can imagine, at that early age, and this is before the internet, email existed, but the internet in its current form didn't exist. You couldn't just ask a question and get a wealth of information like that. It was going to kind of very basic history books and encyclopedias and trying to find out, okay, so what happened? What happened when Spain went from being a fascist dictatorship to a democracy? And these accounts were so brief and so bland, the answer seemed to be nothing happened. There was no revolution. There was no blood in the streets. There was no hunting down and executing of the fascists. There was this transition that was forgettable, and the whole world has forgotten it. And that's exactly the most important kind of transition for us to study and learn from. And that is what's possible for Vietnam. That is what's possible for North Korea. They can make the transition to parliamentary democracy just as smoothly and just as easily as Spain did, or better. I believe the record holder for the most rapid transition to real democracy, in this sense, parliamentary, modern, mainstream democracy, I think the record holder is Mongolia. And again, when I talk to people, even professors with PhDs specialized in the political history of Asia, they are flummoxed. Like, oh, didn't you know there's this enormous part of Asia in the middle of the map that made a bloodless transition from total communist dictatorship? I mean, it was just as brutal as any of the other communist dictatorships. It really was, to basically total democracy. Again, it's not paradise after they have democracy. They have a lot of corruption, but where they have elections and a free press and debate and a parliament and all the other features of democracy. And like the United States, people tend to complain that it's the millionaires who keep getting elected, keep winning elections. People like Mongolia's equivalent to Donald Trump, you know what I mean? But nevertheless, they made this transition. And they even, put some of the old communist leaders who were guilty of crimes against humanity on trial. They had, their equivalent to Nuremberg trials. And they did it in months. They did it so rapidly. And you can ask, what happened? Again, I know more about both of these examples. This is a brief YouTube video. But in a sense, nothing happened, right? This is the problem. People want to deal with history as a series of moral fables, like Little Red Riding Hood. They want a dramatic twist in the tale. Our memories and minds naturally latch onto the most salacious and most extreme examples, right? People talk about learning the lessons of history in this very facile, very shallow way. But history doesn't show that the transition to democracy is something difficult to attain or difficult to maintain. It shows, paradoxically, that it's easy. And I've had to challenge people on this face-to-face. Just as before, I was saying, Bernie Sanders asks, what's the difference between Americans and Scottish people? Do you think Scottish people have a higher level of education? Do you think they're supermen amongst? Do you think they have a higher level of wealth? What do you think it is? Why do you think the Scottish can have health care for the poor and Americans cannot? You have no idea how devastating it is to an ethnically Chinese professor of political science when you ask them, what do you think Mongolians have? Do you think Mongolians are smarter than you as Chinese people? Do you think Mongolians have a higher level of education? Do you think they're wealthier than you? Do you think they're more technologically advanced? Why do you think Mongolians were able to make that transition and you were not? is not the only question you could ask. Of course, Asia has its handful of other successful democracies. Taiwan being one of them. That's why we're going to Taiwan. Japan, product of unique historical circumstances. Each country is the product of unique historical circumstances, is another. But the point is, the transition from dictatorship to democracy need not involve an atom bomb. And for the most part, pessimism about it, whether purely academic or motivated by left-wing revolutionary sentiment or the right-wing sentiment of making excuses for clientelistic dictatorships set up by and maintained by American interests, that pessimism really is misplaced.
Dun, 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 dun.